October 19, 1944, Leyte Island, the Philippines. The jungle air was thick with cordite and fear. American artillery crews, drenched in sweat and mud, worked through the night unloading crates from Liberty ships anchored offshore. The 155mm shells they handled felt heavier than usual, packed with something different. Corporal John Evans noticed it first, a strange reddish dust spilling from a cracked crate, unmarked, unfamiliar. He shrugged, loaded the round, and watched the jungle erupt in fire 3 miles away. The blast shook trees he couldn't even see. Something had changed in American firepower, but he didn't know what. Before we continue, if you're finding value in these untold stories of World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe. What Evans couldn't have known, what no one on that beach could have known, was that the force behind those shells began 3 years earlier in a sun-baked cornfield outside Tyler County, Texas. A farmer named Harold Gentry, mocked by his neighbors for mixing what they called stupid fertilizer, had stumbled onto something the United States War Department would classify as top secret. His backyard experiment, born from drought and desperation, would find its way into hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. It would crack fortifications that conventional explosives couldn't touch. It would help turn the tide in the Pacific. And Harold Gentry would never receive a medal, never see a headline with his name, never even tell his neighbors what he'd done, because sometimes the most important work doesn't make a sound. Harold Gentry was born August 15, 1899, in the piney woods of East Texas, where the soil was red clay and stubbornness was a virtue. His father, Ernest, worked 120 acres of unforgiving land along the Neches River. His mother, Ruth, taught arithmetic in a one-room schoolhouse and believed education didn't stop at the classroom door. Hal grew up barefoot, chasing chickens, mending fences, listening to old men at the general store debate soil pH like it was scripture. But while other boys dreamed of oil rigs and cattle empires, Hal had a stranger fascination: the chemistry of dirt. At 12, he asked his mother for her old coffee tins. Not for marbles, but to test combinations of ash, sand, and manure on wild onions behind the barn. She laughed, but let him. That same year, he borrowed a faded copy of Elementary Agricultural Science from the school library and read it until the spine cracked. By the time he inherited the farm in 1935, during the tail end of the Great Depression, Hal had filled notebooks with handwritten observations, nitrogen experiments, moisture control, yield comparisons. He didn't call himself a scientist. He didn't even finish high school. But he had a habit most men didn't. He wrote down everything. By 1941, with war heating up in Europe and agricultural demand rising across the United States, Hal was struggling. His corn yields hovered around 28 bushels per acre when the state average was 35. The Texas summers were brutal, the clay soil unforgiving. Conventional fertilizers leached away before the crops could absorb them. So Hal started mixing his own. It began with ammonium nitrate, a common nitrogen-rich fertilizer, but it disappeared too fast in his fields. He added ammonium sulfate, hoping the sulfur would slow the release. It helped, but not enough. Then came the charcoal, ground down to a fine dust. It absorbed moisture, held the other compounds together in a way that surprised even him. The texture changed. The soil stayed cooler, greener. He called it Gentry Mix TX41. His neighbors called him crazy. "This ain't no science lab, Hal," one told him at the feed store. "You're making barbecue rub for your plants." But something was happening. On a 3-acre test plot near the back of his property, Hal's corn came in taller, greener, stronger. He recorded a yield of 40 bushels per acre, more than a 40% increase. He thought maybe it was luck, maybe the rainfall. But he tested it again, and again. The numbers held. What Hal didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the chemical composition of his mix bore an uncanny resemblance to early-stage munitions compounds. Not explosive on its own, but stable, dense, and full of potential energy. In a world rushing toward global war, where every scrap of nitrogen could mean the difference between victory and defeat, Hal's backyard experiment was about to become a national secret. And it would start with a letter he never expected to receive. March 5, 1942. The envelope arrived in plain brown paper with no return address. Official business, War Production Board. Hal opened it with the same thick, calloused hands he used to lift feed sacks. Inside was a single-typed page requesting a technical consultation regarding recent formulations of nitrogen-based agricultural material. Near the bottom, one line was underlined in heavy ink. Your compound has properties of interest to national defense research. Hal stared at the letter for a full minute before setting it down next to his half-eaten cornbread. He had no idea why the government would care about what he was doing. But 2 weeks later, he boarded a train in Lufkin with a suitcase in one hand and a notebook in the other. He wore his only wool coat and a hat that hadn't been new since before the Depression. He had never left the state before. By the time he reached Washington, D.C., spring had begun. Cherry blossoms lined the streets, but the mood in the capital was tense. The Japanese had taken the Philippines. U-boats stalked the Atlantic. America was rushing to supply not just its own army, but the entire Allied war machine. Hal was ushered through a side entrance at a nondescript building on Pennsylvania Avenue. No badge, no escort, just a handshake from a man in a gray suit who introduced himself only as Mr. Hartley. They led him to a windowless conference room where two more men waited, one in a lab coat, the other in military brass. A pitcher of water sat untouched at the center of the table. What followed was more interrogation than consultation. They asked how he made the mix, why he chose those ingredients, what he'd noticed in the soil. Hal, nervous but steady, explained everything. The leaching problem, the charcoal solution, the yield increase. He never once used the word explosion, but they did. Colonel Julius Black, the man in uniform, leaned forward. Mr. Gentry, are you aware that your formula, with a slight modification, meets the density and energy thresholds for use in military ordnance? Hal stared at him. Sir, I just wanted my corn to grow. The colonel cracked a smile, but his eyes were serious. Well, you may have just invented a better booster than anything we've got in field use. They didn't explain much else. Security, they said. Hal would be given a contract, a small compensation for his formula, plus ongoing consultation. He would remain on his farm, officially, to avoid attention. The government would do the rest. Before he left, Mr. Hartley pulled him aside. What you made isn't a bomb, he said quietly, but it's part of one. And with the war the way it is, that may be just what we need. Hal nodded, more confused than proud. He returned to Texas with a pocket full of government paperwork and the strange weight of knowing that something from his farm was no longer his alone. The experiment that started with a bag of fertilizer was now under lock and key, and it had a new name: Project Green Grain. By summer 1942, bulldozers were flattening pine forests near a quiet Texas town called Karnak. What had once been farmland was becoming one of the most secretive facilities in the country, the Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant. It would cover over 8,500 acres when finished, more than 13 square miles of ordnance warehouses, loading docks, and production lines. Its purpose, to produce trinitrotoluene, TNT, in mass quantities. But the military needed more than just high explosives. They needed components, fillers, boosters, materials that could stretch limited TNT supplies without compromising firepower. That's where Hal Gentry's formula came in. In a quiet office inside the plant's administrative wing, the words Green Grain Booster Variant TX-F41 were typed onto a production test requisition. It was officially a booster compound, meant to sit between the detonator and the main TNT payload. It had been adapted from Hal's original mix with slight changes. The charcoal ground finer, small amounts of paraffin wax added to prevent moisture absorption. The results surprised even the skeptics. When tested inside a 105mm shell casing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the modified green grain mix burned cleanly, compressed evenly, and transferred force with near-perfect consistency. It wasn't as powerful as TNT, but it didn't need to be. Its job was to amplify, and it did that better than any existing formula at the time. Back in Karnak, engineers at the Longhorn plant were skeptical. One supervisor scoffed, "We're trusting a farmer's dirt recipe to go inside live artillery." But deadlines didn't care about pedigree. The Allied forces were running short on high-grade explosives. The invasion of North Africa had eaten up reserves. The Pacific Theater was expanding, and raw materials like toluene, needed for TNT, were in dangerously short supply. That made Hal's formula more than a novelty. It made it a necessity. By October 1943, the Longhorn plant had fully integrated Project Green Grain into its production schedule. The mix was shipped in sealed drums labeled Booster Variant C and loaded into thousands of 105mm and 155mm shells. It was never listed by name on manifest logs, only the formula code TXF41. Hal wasn't told the full scale of its use. He still rose before dawn, tended his corn, scribbled rainfall numbers into a spiral-bound notebook. But every 2 weeks he received a plain envelope with a check and a one-line update. Field results acceptable. Continue support. He never asked for more. Deep inside the Longhorn plant, engineers began to refer to it by a nickname no one outside the gates ever heard: the Farmer's Fire. No wartime experiment survived without risk, and in early 1944, Hal Gentry's mix nearly met its end, not on the battlefield but in a warehouse. The first sign of trouble came on a rainy morning in February when a routine quality inspection at the Longhorn plant flagged several barrels of TXF41 for moisture intrusion. A thin layer of condensation had formed inside the containers, softening the mix into clumps. The reading was clear: 5.2% moisture by weight. The military safety threshold was 3%. At first, the inspection team thought it was a storage error, but a second batch failed, then a third. Within 72 hours, the plant halted all booster line activity involving green grain. Production delays mounted. A warfront offensive was approaching. Tensions flared. Hal was summoned. He arrived at the plant wearing his same old field jacket, still smelling faintly of dirt and diesel. Security led him through without ceremony. Inside, men in white coats walked briskly between labs and testing bays. Hal felt like he was in a foreign country. They brought him to a long metal table where 2 drums of the wet mix had been opened. A chemist held up a sample and let it crumble through his gloved fingers. "This isn't stable," he said flatly. "If this had been shipped, it could have caused misfires. Worse." Hal asked to see the logs. After 30 minutes flipping through production notes, he spotted a pattern the lab team had missed. Every failed batch had been stored in a new wing of the warehouse, the only one without active dehumidifiers. He pointed it out. The room fell silent. The lead supervisor ran his fingers through his hair. "You're telling me this wasn't a formula problem?" Hal nodded. "Not if the mix was dry going in. You can't blame the dough if the oven's leaking." The fix was fast. All drums were relocated and humidity controls were upgraded. But the incident left a scar. Several top officials at the War Production Board now viewed the green grain booster with suspicion. Some suggested reverting to older compounds despite their lower efficiency. And then a second incident made things worse. In March, at Loading Station 4, a loud thump echoed across the plant. Not a full explosion, but a violent deflagration during shell packing. 3 workers were injured. A preliminary report blamed a static discharge from a metal tool. But when word got out that the shell had been loaded with TXF41, whispers turned into headlines. Hal wasn't implicated, but he felt it just the same. That night he sat on his porch with a ledger in his lap and a cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't light it often, but this wasn't an ordinary night. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he mailed a handwritten letter to the plant manager. It read, "If you think the mix isn't safe, stop using it. I didn't make this to hurt anyone." The reply came back 3 days later, typed in sharp, formal language. "We are resuming green grain use. The issue was procedural, not chemical. Your mix remains valuable. So do you." It wasn't praise, but it was enough. Hal returned to his fields. The doubts didn't vanish, but somewhere between the rows of corn and the hum of the wind, he reminded himself that risk was part of war, and part of discovery. If his mix had a part to play, he would see it through, even if no one ever said thank you. October 20th, 1944. The first American boots hit the shores of Leyte Island at dawn. The sun was just beginning to burn off the morning mist, but the jungle was already alive with gunfire, mortar shells, and the shrill whine of Japanese machine guns hidden in the hills. This was the beginning of General Douglas MacArthur's return, the long-promised liberation of the Philippines. And the Japanese had no intention of giving up without a fight. The landing zones were heavily fortified. Hidden bunkers, camouflage trenches, deeply buried pillboxes turned every inch of ground into a death trap. Allied soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as incoming fire rained down. Progress stalled, casualties mounted, then the sky cracked open. A wall of sound rolled in from the sea. American battleships and cruisers parked miles offshore unleashed their full arsenals in what would become one of the largest naval bombardments of the Pacific War. 155mm shells arced overhead in deadly parabolas. Some carried the names of sweethearts scribbled in pencil. Others carried something far more unusual, a booster compound labeled TXF-41. Inside those shells, nestled between the detonator and the payload, was a powder born in the dirt of East Texas. Hal Gentry's mix. No one on the beach knew it. No one on the battleships knew it. But when the shells hit, they knew something was different. Marine Sergeant Victor Duca, crouching behind a splintered tree stump, later wrote in his field diary, "It sounded like the sky had been peeled open. The ground lifted under us like a mattress. It didn't just explode, it pushed. You could feel it in your chest. I don't know what kind of ammo they used, but the Japs stopped shooting after that." The Japanese defensive line along Red Beach crumbled after 40 minutes of sustained shelling. Reports from forward observers noted that bunkers which had previously withstood conventional blasts were now destroyed beyond recognition. In some cases, the very hillside was torn open. Roots, rock, and rebar thrown high into the trees. The artillery wasn't just suppressing enemy fire, it was erasing their positions. In a memo drafted 2 days after the initial assault, a munitions officer aboard the USS Tennessee wrote, "Shell performance exceeded prior expectations in consistency and detonation spread. Suspect cause is related to new booster compound issued in TX Lot 6. Further testing recommended." That TX Lot 6 was none other than the green grain-enhanced batch shipped from the Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant 4 weeks earlier. It wasn't the only batch. By the time the Leyte campaign reached its peak in November, more than 250,000 shells containing the booster had been fired across the island. An estimated 4 million pounds of material connected to TXF-41 had been used by the end of the campaign. By the time American forces secured Leyte and MacArthur waded ashore, the headlines were full of victory. Soldiers, ships, flags, but there were no pictures of Hal Gentry. No medals, no parades. Only a telegram, TXF-41 contributions acknowledged. Performance exceeds projections. He folded it into his ledger and never spoke of it again. In town, folks still teased him about his goat dust fertilizer. No one knew that same mix had thundered across the Pacific. Sometimes, driving past homes with gold and blue service stars in the windows, Hal wondered if one of those boys had been saved by what he'd made, but he never asked. One spring evening in 1945, his niece asked if he ever wished he'd done more. Hal looked over his fields and said quietly, Sometimes the most important work doesn't make a sound. Years later, when Project Green Grain was declassified, those words finally made sense. Howe never sought credit. He stayed on his farm, tending the soil that had given the world both life and power. His name lived only in a faded government file, Gentry, H, Booster Class C. Maybe that's his real legacy, that history isn't only written by generals, but by those who labor unseen. His fertilizer, born from drought and stubborn hope, became the hidden force behind victory. Not because he meant it to destroy, but because he believed in creation. And when the world finally went quiet, the sound of his work was only the rustle of corn in the wind.